Before we begin, a brief note to you, the listener. What you are about to hear is not a tutorial, and it is not a warning dressed up as one. It is an excavation, a story about a button we all recognize and almost all of us trust. A button that promises relief, closure, and control with a single click. Delete, clear, erase. We press it instinctively, the way earlier generations struck a match or fed paper into a shredder. And most of the time, we do not ask what actually happens next. This story exists because that instinct is wrong, and because the consequences of being wrong have quietly reshaped what privacy means in the modern world. As you listen, resist the urge to jump ahead to solutions. Resist the comfort of thinking this is about criminals or hackers or edge cases. This is about ordinary people using ordinary machines inside an architecture that remembers by default. This is a story about how forgetting stopped being natural, how memory became automated, and how an entire culture learned to mistake silence for safety. Settle in. Let the mechanisms reveal themselves slowly. And listen. Not just for what the delete button does, but for why we needed to believe it worked in the first place. For most of human history, memory was a burden you had to carry with your hands. To preserve anything, you needed a medium that would obey you. Stone, paper, film, magnetic tape. Recording the past required friction. It required space. It required time. It required matter. And because memory was physical, forgetting was the default condition of ordinary life. If you did not write it down, it vanished. If you wanted a secret to disappear, you burned it. You shredded it. You buried it. You did not need a philosophy of deletion because you already lived inside one. Destruction was absolute enough to feel final. When the paper turned to ash, the information ceased to exist in any usable form. It was not perfect, but it was honest. Privacy was not an option in the settings menu. Privacy was an emergent property of effort. That physics shaped our instincts. We built our expectations about discretion on the fact that most things were never recorded in the first place. A conversation in a park evaporated unless someone was physically present to remember it, or unless a microphone had been hidden close enough to matter. A purchase made with cash produced no database entry that could later be queried, sorted, and sold. A mistake could fade, not because people were kind, but because evidence was expensive. Even when traces remained, they were fragile. A pencil mark could be erased, yet the indentation still pressed into the page, a faint reminder that forgetting was never total. But time helped you. Paper yellowed, ink bled, witnesses forgot. Entropy, as a practical force, leaned toward disappearance. The universe wanted to lose information. The analog world did not protect you out of morality. It protected you because recording was hard. Then we crossed into a different bargain. We traded filing cabinets for hard drives, letters for email, diaries for feeds. In that transaction, we did not merely gain convenience. We inverted the direction of effort. Recording became automatic. Forgetting became labor. The shift was so complete that we barely noticed it happening. The interface kept the old language, files, folders, trash. The screen tried to make the new world feel like the old one, but the architecture underneath was alien. A physical folder can only exist in one place. A digital folder can exist in 1,000 places at once, duplicated without loss, copied without the original being diminished. The metaphors stayed familiar because familiarity kept people calm. Calm kept people clicking. The early web arrived as a window, not as a surveillance device. It looked innocent. A browser was framed as a portal to information, a tool of curiosity, a new kind of library. Netscape, Internet Explorer, a blinking cursor, a cathode ray to glow. People sat in bedrooms and offices and began to click their way through a growing maze. To make that maze usable, engineers had to solve a problem that sounds trivial until you remember what the web actually was. The internet did not know where you had been. A page was requested and delivered, then the connection dissolved. The web was stateless, it did not remember you, so the browser had to remember for you. Back button required a list, a stack of recent places stored so you could reverse your steps. It was a convenience feature, the digital equivalent of breadcrumbs. And once the browser maintained that list, it was natural to surface it to the user, history. The word sounded harmless, a feature for usability, a small comfort, a way to find something again. At first, people treated the browser like a television. You turned it off and the show was gone. You assumed that if the screen was dark, your journey had ended. But the machine was dutiful. It was designed to be helpful. It saved the addresses so you could return. It saved the images so the page would load faster the next time. Caching was not marketed as memory. It was marketed as speed. A practical improvement. A better experience. What it really meant was that your computer was quietly building an archive of you. This was the beginning of the gap that would define everything that came after. The user saw a surface that could be wiped clean. The machine saw a system that must be maintained. The user wanted browsing to feel ephemeral, like looking through a window. The machine made browsing persistent, like making photocopies of whatever you glanced at and filing them away automatically. In the early days, there was no panic because there was no awareness. Millions of computers collected years of browser artifacts untouched. Temporary files that were not temporary in any meaningful sense. Lists of URLs that no one thought of as evidence. Small images cached because it made life smoother. The web matured and slowly the use cases changed. Browsing became personal. It became secretive. It moved from public curiosity to private vulnerability. The family computer made this shift visible. One shared machine in a hallway or living room, used by parents and children, guests and siblings. One person's late-night searches became another person's morning autocomplete. A single letter typed into an address bar could reveal an entire hidden itinerary. In that moment, the browser stopped being a neutral tool and started feeling like a witness. Not a witness to crimes, necessarily, but a witness to the parts of a person they preferred to keep unspoken. Medical questions, financial fears, sexual curiosity, lonely confessions typed into search engines because it felt safer than saying them aloud. The shock was not that the web contained these things. The shock was that the computer remembered them. The market responded before the browser makers did. Third-party utilities appeared, selling relief. They promised to clean your tracks, to erase evidence, to wash the machine clean. The language was revealing. Evidence eliminator, history killer, track eraser. They didn't market convenience. They marketed absolution. And the browser companies learned a lesson that would echo for decades. People would not keep using a system that made them feel exposed unless you gave them a ritual that made them feel safe again. The ritual did not need to be technically complete. It needed to be psychologically satisfying. This is where the delete button, as a cultural object, truly begins. Not as a feature of operating systems, which had long allowed file deletion, but as a promise about personal history. Clear history, delete cookies, clear browsing data. These were presented as reset switches, a way to return to innocence. The act was framed as irreversible. Confirmation dialogues warned you that you were crossing a line that could not be undone. Progress bars filled slowly, then snapped to completion. Lists vanished. The user exhaled. The screen looked clean. The relief was real. But beneath the pixels, almost nothing had changed. To understand why, you have to stop thinking of deletion as an act and start thinking of it as bookkeeping. A computer does not store files the way a person stores papers in labeled folders. A computer stores data across a vast surface and keeps a map of where the pieces are. On old spinning hard drives, that surface is a platter coated in magnetic grains. Writing a file means physically flipping the orientation of those grains. It is a change in the material world, not a metaphor. Ones and zeros are not abstract. They are states of matter. The operating system keeps a directory that says which clusters on the disk belong to which file. It is a table of contents, a ledger of ownership, a record of where the fragments begin and end. When you hit delete, the operating system typically does the laziest thing possible, and it does it for rational reasons. Actually, erasing a file by overwriting every sector takes time. It consumes power, it wears out the medium, it delays the user. So instead, the system updates the ledger. It marks the space as available. It changes a status flag. It removes the file from your view and tells itself that those clusters can be reused later. The data itself remains where it was. The file is not destroyed, it is orphaned. A useful analogy is not a trash can, but a library catalog. Imagine a library where books are scattered on shelves without order, and the catalog is the only thing that tells you where to find a title. Deletion, in most consumer systems, is not burning the book. It is removing the card from the catalog and stamping the shelf location as free. The book is still there, sitting on the shelf, readable to anyone who knows how to look without using the catalog. The computer, for everyday operations, agrees to pretend the book does not exist. But pretending is not erasing. This is why the phrase unallocated space is so misleading. It sounds like a void, a blankness, an absence. In forensic reality, it is one of the most crowded places in modern life. Unallocated space is full of abandoned fragments. Drafts you never sent, images you never saved, pages you looked at for 10 seconds, bits of conversations cached and indexed. The only thing that truly kills data is overwriting when new information lands on top of old information and replaces its physical representation. Even then, the kill is rarely clean. Files do not always align perfectly with the size of the clusters they occupy. This creates slack space, portions of a cluster that are allocated to a new file but not fully used by it. The operating system stops reading at the official end of the new file, but the remaining slack can contain the tail end of whatever used to be there. Old secrets preserved in the shadow of new content, protected by the very thing that replaced them. The illusion persists because the interface is designed to make it feel like destruction. The sound effects matter, the paper crumple, the whoosh, the emptying of the bin. These cues trigger a basic human comfort with physical disposal. They tell your brain what it wants to hear. It is gone. You are clean. That design is not accidental. It is trust theater, a performance that produces relief. Modern storage complicates the story without rescuing the user. Solid-state drives do not have spinning platters. They store data in flash memory cells that behave differently. SSDs often use a feature called trim, which tells the drive which blocks are no longer in use so it can manage performance. In some cases, trim and internal garbage collection can make recovery harder because the drive may proactively clear blocks. But unpredictability does not equal privacy. You do not control when the purge happens. It may occur quickly, or it may not. And even if local recovery becomes difficult, the broader system has already replicated your data elsewhere. More importantly, modern operating systems create extra copies of your files for safety and convenience. Shadow copies, snapshots, previous versions, time machine backups. These are silent Polaroids taken in the background so the system can rescue you from accidents. That help becomes betrayal when your goal is disappearance. You delete the original, but the snapshot remains. You empty the trash, but a backup vault retains a copy. The user believes they performed an act of erasure. The system, designed for continuity, preserved the past as a precaution. This is the point where deletion stops being a personal action and becomes an epistemic conflict between two kinds of reality. The first is the user interface reality, where actions are symbolic and outcomes are visible. The second is the architectural reality, where the system is optimized for reliability, speed, and recoverability. Privacy is not one of the default priorities. When the two realities clash, the interface usually wins, not because it is true, but because it is what the user experiences. Digital forensics exists in the gap between those realities. It is the discipline of reading what the interface tries to hide. It is not magic, it is archaeology. It takes the comforting lies of the user experience and treats them as irrelevant. When a device is seized, it enters a world defined not by drama, but by process. A technician connects a drive through a write blocker so nothing is altered. An image of the storage is created, a bit-for-bit replica. Tools like Autopsy, Encase, and FTK ingest that image and begin extracting artifacts, the byproducts of ordinary computing that users rarely understand. Every interaction creates artifacts. Browsers create databases that track visits, cache folders that store content, cookies that store identifiers, download histories, session restore files, favicons, tiny icons that can prove a site was visited even when other evidence is fragmented. On older Windows systems, Internet Explorer used a file called index.dat, a notoriously persistent repository of browsing records that was difficult to delete because the system kept it open. Modern browsers often store history and cookies in SQLite databases, structured data stores that can be parsed with precision. When a user deletes history, a row might be removed from the visible list, but traces can remain in the database file itself or in unallocated space, or in the write-ahead logs that databases use to maintain integrity. Forensic tools know these patterns. They parse them. They reconstruct them. They turn the absence of a visible history list into a trail of residual evidence. The most unsettling part is how much intent can be inferred from the details. A visit count can suggest pattern. A typed count can suggest deliberateness. Redirect chains can show whether you arrived directly or were led there. Timestamps establish chronology. And once you build a timeline from multiple sources, the act of deletion itself becomes an event. Running a cleaner application becomes a marker. A gap in the record becomes a shape that fits the missing piece. In investigations, the attempt to erase history can appear as consciousness of guilt, not because the content is inherently criminal, but because the act signals awareness that the content matters. Operating systems contribute their own betrayals. Windows does not only store files, it stores behavior. The registry is not merely a configuration store, it is a nervous system with memory. Forensic analysts look for artifacts that reveal program execution and folder access. User assist keys track applications run, obfuscated with a simple substitution that hides nothing from anyone who knows to decode it. Shellbag entries record folder views and window positions so the system can restore them later, leaving traces of directories even after they are deleted. Recent file lists, jump lists, prefetch files that optimize program launch times by recording execution patterns. The system is a machine that remembers in order to serve you better. Every convenience is a record. Every optimization is a confession. So you might succeed in scrubbing one surface. You might clear browser history and delete files and empty trash and even wipe free space. You might physically destroy a drive, grind it into dust, and feel you have finally won. But even if the device is truly sanitized, the story is not over because the device was never the only witness. It was just one endpoint. By the time you decide to delete, the data has already left your house. This is where the myth of delete history becomes systemic. The internet is not something that happens on your screen. It is a transit system built out of cables, routers, switching stations, data centers, and servers that record what they handle because recording is how they function. The moment your request leaves your device, it passes through infrastructure you do not control. Your internet service provider knows when you connected and how long you stayed connected. Even without seeing content, it can record metadata that is sufficient to establish behavior patterns. In many jurisdictions, retention is mandated. Logs are kept for months or years. They exist outside your reach. Your delete button has no jurisdiction there. Then there is the destination, the website or a service you contacted. Web servers keep diaries by default. Access logs record IP addresses, timestamps, and requested resources. They do this for debugging, security, and analytics. Even if a company claims it does not care about individual users, the technical layer often records the interaction anyway. Those logs are then aggregated into metrics: retention, engagement, conversion, fraud detection. The record of your browsing becomes valuable not only as a security measure, but as an economic asset. Your late-night search is not treated as vulnerability. It is treated as a data point. Redundancy makes deletion harder. The internet was designed for survivability, not for privacy. It is built to route around failure. To achieve speed, companies replicate data across content delivery networks. A file posted in one place is copied to edge servers around the world, so it can be delivered quickly to users in different regions. When you delete something, you are often sending a command to the origin server, but cached copies may persist. Purge requests can fail. Propagation can lag. Mirrors can keep a ghost alive. The architecture prioritizes availability. It is designed to keep serving content even when parts of the system are down. That design is the enemy of clean erasure. Backups are the ultimate form of systemic memory. Responsible companies create snapshots of databases on schedules, hourly, daily, weekly. These snapshots are moved into cold storage, sometimes on tape, sometimes in vaults, sometimes in off-site facilities designed to withstand disasters. They are meant to be immutable. If a system crashes and must be restored, the backup resurrects what was lost. From the perspective of resilience, this is salvation. From the perspective of deletion, it is nightmare logic. You delete a post today, but the post exists in yesterday's snapshot. And if restoration is required, the deleted content can return because the system is built to preserve continuity, not to honor forgetting. Third-party archives add another layer. The web is crawled, scraped, captured. Services exist to preserve snapshots for historical record. A page can vanish from the live web, yet remain visible in archived form. In those cases, deletion is not a technical act. It is a negotiation with history. The arrogance of the delete button is that it assumes you are the only one with a copy. The internet does not behave like a whiteboard you can wipe. It behaves like a photocopier that never stops running. Once copies exist, control disperses. As the infrastructure hardened, the nature of data expanded beyond what users consciously created. At first, history meant the pages you visited. Then it included the byproducts of visiting them: cookies, cache, session tokens, autocomplete, DNS caches. The local system keeps a list of recent domain lookups to speed up future connections. That list can reveal the sites you accessed, even when you never logged into them, and even when you cleared a visible browser list. And beyond local traces, networks collect metadata because routing requires it. Communication needs addressing. The network must know where to send packets. Servers must know who is contacting them to respond. Metadata is not a moral failure. It is a structural requirement. That is why metadata is so powerful. It can reveal a story without reading content, patterns of movement, patterns of contact, patterns of interest. You do not need to read a diary to infer a secret if the diary's timestamps and destinations already disclose it. The modern economy turned that structural necessity into a marketplace. Data brokers exist to aggregate fragments and resell them. Many users never interact with these companies directly, yet their lives are present in those databases as profiles and segments. The raw material comes from everywhere: apps, websites, ISPs, loyalty programs, public records, voter registrations, property records, credit headers, purchase lists. The moment data is sold, it fractures, it multiplies. It becomes an asset on someone else's balance sheet. You can delete your account with an app, but you cannot recall what the app already sold. You can close a browser tab, but you cannot revoke what was logged upstream. This is where the idea of ownership becomes slippery. The user experiences data as personal because it describes them. The market experiences data as transferable because it is stored as rows and identifiers that can be merged. A person becomes a cluster of attributes: interest categories, likelihood scores, risk profiles, purchasing propensity, location patterns. The profile does not require your name to influence your life. It only requires that your devices and identifiers remain linkable. Even when companies claim the data is anonymized, re-identification can be possible when multiple datasets are combined. The broker's job is to stitch, to match a hashed email to a device identifier, to a location trail, to a transaction pattern. The result is not a diary. It is a prediction engine. And the most unsettling aspect is that you can be present in this ecosystem even if you try to opt out. The shadow profile is the profile that forms around the negative space you occupy. Your friends upload contact lists. Photos include you. People message you. Companies infer you through your relationships. A network graph does not need your consent to model your existence if enough adjacent nodes disclose you indirectly. You cannot delete a profile you never created. because it was assembled from other people's actions, and the system's incentive is to fill gaps, not to respect absence. Against this backdrop, the browser makers offered a new comfort feature: private browsing, incognito in private, a dark theme window, a spy icon, the visual language of espionage. It feels like a shield. It feels like a mode that changes the rules, but the fine print reveals the truth that the iconography tries to obscure. Private browsing typically only changes what your local device saves. It may not store your history list. It may clear cookies at the end of a session. It may not save form entries, but it does not make you invisible. Websites still see you. Your ISP still routes you. Your employer or school still monitors the network if you are using theirs. Private browsing protects you from the next person who uses your laptop. It does not protect you from the infrastructure that handled your traffic. The spy mask is cardboard. It is another form of trust theater. Trust theater is not limited to private browsing. It appears in padlocks and shields and green check marks. It appears in cookie banners that pretend to offer choice while guiding you toward acceptance. It appears in toggles labeled "Do Not Track" that historically lacked enforcement and were treated as advisory rather than binding. It appears in settings that make privacy feel like a personal preference instead of a structural conflict. The user is asked to manage hundreds of vendors, dozens of categories, and endless configurations, while accept all is one bright button. The friction is intentional. It is a design choice that aligns with economic incentives. If privacy were effortless, the current business model of the web would collapse. Retention is profitable. Deletion is loss. So what would real deletion look like in such a system? On a single device, true sanitization requires overwriting data or using secure erase methods provided by the drive. It can take hours. It is not a friendly button because it is not a friendly process. On physical media, the most reliable deletion is destruction. Degaussing, shredding, grinding, incineration. These are the methods used by institutions that cannot afford ambiguity. They do not rely on metaphors. They do not rely on a trash icon. They rely on physics. But even if you destroy your drive, the network retains traces. That is why the more honest approach to privacy in a world of systemic memory is not always erasure. Sometimes it is denial of intelligibility. Encryption is the closest thing the modern world has to a meaningful delete because it can turn stored data into noise by removing the key. If the key is gone, the data may still exist as bits on disks and in backups, but it becomes functionally unreadable, not because it was destroyed, but because it was made useless. This is a different philosophy. It accepts that storage is inevitable and focuses on control over meaning. End-to-end encryption does not prevent logging of metadata, and it does not erase footprints. It is not a universal solution, but it reveals an important distinction. The goal of deletion is often not to remove every last copy, which can be impossible, but to prevent the past from being weaponized. Encryption can deny adversaries the content even when the existence of the communication is visible. It is a shift from trying to clean the slate to trying to make the writing illegible. Law tries to intervene where engineering cannot. In Europe, the right to erasure emerged as a legal principle, often associated with the idea of the right to be forgotten. The concept is powerful as a cultural claim. People should not be haunted forever by old mistakes. There should be a path back to ordinary life. But law must wrestle with a borderless network. A link removed in one jurisdiction may remain visible in another. Data stored in one region may be accessible under another region's legal demands. Companies facing compliance risk often keep data longer, not shorter. Preservation becomes safer than deletion when lawsuits and subpoenas are possible. The legal system tries to impose forgetting on an architecture built for retention, and the result is often partial, uneven, and contested. There is also a tension between personal erasure and public record. If individuals can compel deletion of information that is true, society risks losing legitimate historical memory. The past is not only a private possession, it is sometimes a public concern. The conflict is not easily resolved because it touches different kinds of harm. The harm of permanent stigma versus the harm of rewritten history. The right to be forgotten, in practice, often becomes the right to be harder to find, rather than the right to truly vanish. Delisting can reduce visibility. It cannot guarantee absence. The deeper issue is that modern systems were built without decay. In the physical world, decay is not a feature. It is nature's default. Things fade. Materials break down. Without constant maintenance, records become unreadable. That natural forgetting created social flexibility. It allowed reinvention. It allowed time to soften sharp edges. Digital systems, by contrast, preserve perfectly. A file from 20 years ago can be copied without degradation and retrieved in seconds. The past does not fade. It accumulates. And in a world where accumulation is cheap, institutions will hoard because hoarding seems harmless until someone weaponizes what was stored. We can see attempts to reintroduce decay through ephemerality, messages that disappear, posts that vanish after a day, timers on conversations. But ephemerality is difficult to guarantee because recipients can capture screenshots, services can retain server-side copies for abuse detection, and backups can still preserve content. Still, the idea points toward a more profound redesign. Digital decay would mean building expiration into data by default. Time-to-live tags, automatic deletion schedules, minimized retention, and systems that treat storage as temporary unless explicitly required. That would be a reversal of the current default. It would be a cultural change as much as a technical one, because the economy of prediction depends on retention. To build forgetting into the infrastructure would mean accepting less certainty, less monetizable memory, and less convenient reconstruction. The myth of delete history persists because it is a story we want to believe. It is a bedtime story for a species still adapting to the consequences of its own tools. We prefer to imagine that control is something we can exercise with a click. We want a clean boundary between past and present, between mistake and consequence, between curiosity and record. The interface offers that boundary because without it, users would feel exposed, and exposed users stop engaging. The delete button is not only a feature, it is a peace treaty between human psychology and machine architecture. It tells you that you can exit without leaving footprints, even when the floor is wet cement. But the truth is not that the world is hopeless. The truth is that control must be understood differently. If you treat deletion as an absolute, you will be constantly betrayed because the system is built against absolutes. If you treat privacy as a process, you can make meaningful choices. You can minimize what you generate. You can reduce what you share. You can separate identities. You can harden devices. You can encrypt. You can choose services with better retention policies. You can pressure institutions through law and culture to respect limits. None of this is as satisfying as pressing a button and hearing a whoosh. None of it produces instant relief, but it is closer to reality. There is also a moral clarity that comes with abandoning the myth. If you understand that the machine remembers by default, you stop mistaking silence for safety. You stop assuming that absence of a visible list means absence of evidence. You begin to see that every click is a mark, not always a dramatic mark, but a mark that can be combined with others into a narrative you did not intend to write. You begin to recognize the asymmetry. You have a body and a life and limited time. The system has infinite storage, automated collection, and economic incentives to keep what you would prefer to discard. The fight is not between you and a button. It is between your desire for reinvention and an infrastructure optimized for permanence. In a sense, the story of Delete history is the story of modern adulthood. It is the loss of a certain innocence about what it means to move through the world unobserved. The analog era did not guarantee privacy, but it made surveillance expensive enough that most people were spared most of the time. The digital era makes surveillance cheap enough that it can be ambient. It can be background. It can be justified as optimization. That is why it is so pervasive. It is not always fueled by malice. It is fueled by convenience, by business models, by the quiet logic of systems that remember because remembering is useful. When you clear your browsing data, you are not performing an act of annihilation. You are performing a ritual of local tidiness. You are wiping fingerprints off your own desk while the building's security cameras keep rolling. You are burning your copy of a receipt while the store keeps theirs, and the payment processor keeps theirs, and the analytics vendor keeps theirs, and the backup system keeps a snapshot of all of them. The act may still have value. It may protect you from casual discovery. It may reduce some artifacts. It may remove immediate embarrassment on a shared device. But it is not what the myth says it is. It is not erasure from existence. It is not control over the past. The true power of understanding this is that it reframes the future. If the problem were simply that users did not have the right button, the solution would be product design, a better feature, a stronger, cleaner, a smarter app. But the problem is deeper. The problem is that the architecture of the internet treats memory as a virtue and forgetting as a flaw. The problem is that markets profit from prediction, and prediction requires history. The problem is that law and security incentives often reward retention. The delete button cannot fix that because it was never designed to. So the question becomes less about how to erase and more about how to rebuild a world where reinvention is possible. That may mean limiting retention by default. It may mean treating certain kinds of data as toxic waste rather than as a commodity. It may mean forcing transparency about who holds copies and for how long. It may mean enforcing data minimization. It may mean building systems that degrade gracefully, where old data loses fidelity and becomes less weaponizable over time. It may mean giving people meaningful control over keys rather than over files, so they can deny meaning even when storage persists. It may mean shifting norms so that ancient mistakes are not treated as permanent identity. And it may mean something even simpler and more difficult. It may mean cultural forgiveness. Because if the network never forgets, society must decide whether it will punish people forever. The myth of delete history is not only a technical misunderstanding, it is a social wish. It is the wish that you can be more than your worst day. The analog world granted that wish accidentally through friction and decay. The digital world removes that accident. If we want the same mercy, we will have to build it on purpose. In the end, the story is not that we are doomed to live with ghosts. It is that we already do and we always have. But the ghosts used to fade. Now they do not. They wait in unallocated space, in caches, in logs, in backups, in broker databases, in archives, in model training datasets, and in the quiet places where system designers chose speed over secrecy and convenience over disappearance. The button still sits there, polite and comforting, asking if you are sure, warning you that the action cannot be undone, offering a progress bar that feels like a promise. It will continue to exist because people need rituals, and the web needs people. But the ritual is not the reality. The reality is that deletion is often administrative, not physical. That your device is only one witness. That the network remembers by design. That the economy buys what you would rather discard. And that the only way to live sanely inside that reality is to stop confusing a clean screen with a clean record. To understand what the machine is, what it was built to do, and what it cannot do without being rebuilt. Because the myth of delete history was never a lie told by a villain. It was a story told by an interface and believed by a culture because it made the new world feel survivable. We are past the era where that story is sufficient. We are awake now, not in the sense of panic, and not in the sense of paranoia, but in the sense of clarity. The past does not vanish because you asked it to. It persists because persistence is profitable, because persistence is convenient, because persistence is how the system protects itself from failure. If we want forgetting again, we will have to engineer it, legislate it, and normalize it. We will have to admit that the default architecture of the digital age is memory, and that memory without mercy becomes a trap. The delete button cannot unlock that trap. It can only make the bars harder to see. If you've made it this far, you already understand something most people never stop to consider. The problem was never that you didn't click the right button. The problem was believing the button was the boundary. Deletion, as we've seen, is rarely an ending. It is a handoff. A local gesture in a global system designed to preserve, replicate, and profit from memory. But understanding this is not an invitation to despair. It is an invitation to clarity. Clarity changes behavior. It changes expectations. It changes what we demand from the tools we use and the institutions that build them. If this story changed how you think about privacy, control, or the quiet after you clear your history, share it with someone who still trusts the silence of the screen. Subscribe if you want to follow the deeper histories behind the technologies we treat as ordinary. And the next time you see that button hovering patiently in a menu, remember this. The machine does not forget because you asked it to. Forgetting has to be designed, defended, and chosen. And now, at least, you know why.